Thank you so much, Tanya. And it's a pleasure to be here today. So Johannah is going to be controlling the slides as we go along, so I will just say next slide, please, throughout the presentation.
And Beth, I'm just going to jump in really quickly and say to folks, I know everybody knows this. We've all been on hundreds probably now of Zoom calls, but if your Zoom boxes are covering something you want to read in the slide, feel free to drag them around and move all the lovely faces so you can read the slides better. I always feel like it's good to remind us that we can do that.
All right. So like I said, I'm super excited to be here today. Today I'm going to be giving a brief history of today's power grid, how the grid today works, and the changes to come. Also, why as a municipality would you be interested in a project that helps you generate your own power? And if you do decide to pursue that project, why would you want to own it? We'll also be going over briefly some pre-development next steps, should you feel that that's the right next step for your municipality. And we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions, so we can talk about anything as questions come up. So next slide, please. So the history of our nation's utility system is absolutely fascinating and deserves its own educational event. But today I'm going to keep it short and sweet. The design of our electrical system is over 100 years old. In the early days of electricity production, producers would each develop their own distribution system, which was costly and often led to underused infrastructure and wasted electricity. In February, I visited Vietnam, and while I was there, I saw the picture on the left, the one with the blue sky in the background. While I don't know anything about Vietnam's regulatory structure, I imagine that this is kind of what the early days of the grid looked like. So back to the 1900s. Over time, as technology improved, it enabled power plants to get bigger and bigger and farther away from population centers. And the power that they generated and delivered got cheaper and cheaper. This created two underlying structural conditions for the electricity market. Extremely high barriers to entry because the big power plants and long distance transmission lines were very expensive, and enormous economies of scale because the average cost of delivered power got cheaper and cheaper with each new expansion of demand. Next slide, please. So those two conditions yielded what economists call a natural monopoly. Given this high fixed cost of building power plants and power grids, it didn't make sense to have multiple companies making those investments. And given the economies of scale, it didn't make sense to have multiple companies competing over the same set of customers. Instead, for a given geographic area, it made more sense for one entity to do it all. Build the power plants, generate the power, and deliver it to customers. In exchange for the monopoly, access to customers within a geographic territory, the utility would provide reliable, non-discriminatory power at the lowest possible cost. As quasi-public entities, utilities cannot profit. However, they can charge whatever rates are necessary to cover their fixed costs, like infrastructure, and variable costs, like fuel, and provide reasonable returns to their investors. Utilities were essentially financing mechanisms to ensure their investment rates and returns are reasonable, and that their rates and returns are reasonable. They are overseen by a state-based public utility commission, the main PUC in our case, which has access to their financial records and final say over their rates and rules. This model was designed for one purpose above all, to electrify the country. Utilities had every incentive to build, knowing that the more they built, the higher their returns. It was guaranteed by law. The more they built, the cheaper power got, and the cheaper power got, the more people used. And then the more people used, the more utilities needed to build. It was an enormous, rapid expansion of an economy, of economic activity and public welfare. Next slide, please. So like I said, our grid was built over 100 years ago, and it was built to have power flowing in one direction, from the power plant to your home or building through a series of transmission and distribution lines. The power plants can be turned on and off precisely to match supply with ever-shifting demand. However, technology has dramatically changed since the early 1900s, and I'd like to take a closer look today at how these changing technologies can benefit Maine municipalities. Next slide, please. So there's a term that you're going to begin to hear quite often as you dig into these projects, and that term is distributed energy resource, or DER. What does that mean? So in our case, distributed energy resources describe the vast array of small-scale technologies owned by customers, like rooftop solar or a small freestanding array, home batteries or municipal batteries, electric cars and their charging points, and the heating and cooling appliances that can talk to each other and respond to signals from the grid. These resources have a myriad of benefits, and I'd like to dive into those now. Next slide, please. So as a municipality, why would you want to build this project that generates electricity or invest in one of these DERs? We're here today because you want to be meeting clean energy goals that have been set by Maine and our local government, your local government. These projects also address the ongoing costs and expensive future upgrades from the utility. They also increase resilience during grid service interruptions like power outages. Next slide, please. So Maine has set ambitious clean energy goals to mitigate climate change and build a more resilient grid. DERs can help support this. Your municipality may have also declared some goals as well. Next slide, please. These goals do not only reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, but these investments also significantly reduce utility costs while better preparing Maine for climate changes and increasing impacts from those climate change. Inaction will eventually cost Maine substantially more, and those costs will accelerate over time. DER lowers power costs and increases the reliability of the power grid. Project owners and the public benefit from avoiding these costs and emissions from new fossil fuel-based generation or transmission lines. So I'd like to give an example of that in a case study. So next slide, please. So Con Ed in New York was one of the first projects to successfully and proactively source local DER and develop creative solutions to defer traditional utility investment and manage load growth. Following an increased focus on climate resiliency due to Superstorm Sandy, plus a projected 69 megawatt overload, Con Ed was forced to consider a $1.2 billion upgrade to their utility just to service their customers. Instead, however, Con Ed pursued a mix of traditional grid upgrades and distributed solutions that totaled in cost 1/5 of what it would have cost to just do the traditional grid upgrades. So the solutions included a portfolio of DERs, such as energy efficiency, demand response, battery storage, and solar. Next slide, please. DERs also dramatically increase grid resilience during power outages. I don't need to tell anyone on this call that Maine experiences a bunch of power outages. I was at the PUC earlier this week, and I found a filing where Versant reported their average number of outages across the system and how long these outages last. According to them, they have 2.46 outages events per year on any section of the grid. And these outages on average last 5.43 hours. Now, these are just averages, and I'm from NDI, so I know how variable those figures can be. Earlier around Christmas time, my parents were without power for 3 days because of a windstorm that came through. I was in a different part of the island, and I only lost power for 10 minutes because I happened to be on the part of the grid that that has power routed to the hospital. So it's a higher priority line. It was fixed much faster, or power was rerouted much faster. So in areas of the grid like my parents have, or in Southwest Harbor, or in Tremont, in areas that don't have hospitals right next door, DERs can really help resiliency during those blackouts. So next slide, please. So they'll allow you to, when designed with resilience in mind, DERs will allow you to continue critical operation during outages. We call these black sky events. Increased disaster, they also increase disaster preparedness and ability to respond. And if you're looking to create something like a community resilience hub, you can create a space that would be the central point for gathering, assessing impact, sharing stories, assembling information, assessing the resources that you have on hand, and spearheading response. So it can be really critical during power outages to have these resources online and as a support for the community. Next slide, please. So given the amount of benefits that these DERs provide, I want to take a look at the programs in Maine that are supporting the installation of these resources. And from here on out, I'm going to primarily focus on solar, which when paired with battery storage is extremely valuable as a distributed energy resource, and really can add resilience to these buildings. So in Maine, we have net energy billing, which allows you to construct both in front of and behind the meter. So I'll start with like a behind a meter project, which in Maine, that essentially means a solar array that would be installed on your roof. They're connected directly with the building's electrical system. And when the sun is out, the solar panels generate electricity that flows directly into the building, and provides the building with heat pump, the power to power heat pumps, computers, and lights. So it's used on site. And then if at any given moment that solar array is generating more power than the building needs at any given time, the excess power is sent to the utility grid and supplies the surrounding area. These projects are best for increasing resilience and building resilience hubs when paired with on-site storage. In front of the meter project is something that would be connected directly to the electric grid. So for example, the Tremont array that we have on a landfill next to the municipal building. So that would be in front of the meter project. So all the electricity that is produced is exported to the grid and tracked by Versant or CMP, depending on what area of the grid your project is built in. These projects offer local generation and substantial financial savings, but unless they are coupled with an on-site battery that is directly tied to your resilience hub or building, they do not offer additional power during outages for safety reasons. So because of net energy billing, the town would earn credit for the energy that they export to the grid. At the end of each month, Versant Power or CMP would compare how much the project exported versus how much you imported or used over the month. And the difference would then be applied to your bill. If you generate more than you use in any given month, the credits are banked and can be applied to your utility bill for up to 12 months. And this is a really helpful program in Maine because in the summer, you're producing 4 times the amount of energy that you will be in the winter. And so you can really bank those credits to utilize during the gray months. And this is a Kickstarter program for electricity generation projects in Maine, primarily solar, and will not be a permanent program. So this is really to get early adopters of solar and solar projects financially supported across the grid. Next slide, please. So the federal landscape has changed as well. Historically, non-taxable entities like nonprofits and municipalities have not been able to access the significant federal tax credits that make solar economically viable for homeowners and businesses. However, in the beginning of January 2023, nonprofits are now eligible to receive a direct payment from the IRS, which reimburses 30% of the solar project's equipment and installation costs. Local governments and higher education institutions, as well as other exempt organizations, can now treat tax credits like they have earned an overpayment of taxes and received a direct payment from the US Treasury as a tax refund. So on top of the 30% direct payment, there is the potential for adders, including a 10% domestic content adder, a 10% adder if the project is built on a brownfield site like a landfill, and a 10% adder for low-income communities. The IRS review is still in process, and the details about these additional adders are still being defined. But that said, many of our local nonprofits and municipalities should be able to earn at least one, if not two, of these 10% adders, which would amount to a total of 40 to 50% of a solar project's total cost. So what does that look like for your municipality? I ran some theoretical numbers, and I'll go through this example for the group. Next slide, please. So in this example, I ran the numbers for a 500 kilowatt array built on a capped landfill. This array would be between 1.5 to 2.5 acres and would cost roughly $1.25 million before tax incentives. However, because it's built on a landfill, I've added that 10% brownfield construction adder and the investment tax credit from the IRA, from the federal government. And so all of that amounts to quite a bit of money, about $500,000. And so after the tax incentives are considered, you're looking at a $750,000 project all in. So I calculated what the municipal bond payment would be at 3.85%. Now this is the what Bar Harbor was able to get for their municipal solar array, and so that's the figure I used. That's going to be variable. So again, you're going to have to rerun all of these numbers when you're actually looking at your project. But for this theoretical array, the year one savings were $67,000 for the municipality if they owned and financed the project themselves. So next slide, please. So what does that mean long term? So I ran some numbers to take a look at what the municipality would get if they subscribe to an array. And I did a generous subscription at 20%. And at the end of the day, over 25 years, if they kept a steady 20% discount off their power, they would save about $770,000. Yeah, $770,000. However, if the municipality decided to finance the array themselves, at the end of 25 years, they would have saved roughly $2.8 million. So there's substantial financial reason why the municipality would be interested in financing the project rather than just subscribing to an array. Next slide, please. There are other reasons as well. Besides being relatively easily subscribed to, there are a lot of cons that come with solar subscriptions. As electricity rates continue to rise, so will the cost of your subscription. the contract rate that you sign up with is tied to electricity costs and not a set rate. And so that's a really important detail when you're looking at these subscription contracts, because like I said, as power prices continue to rise, so will the cost of that subscription. It's also not technically green energy. The developers of these projects sell the renewable energy credits to polluters in order for them to offset their carbon footprint. And so while you're purchasing the net energy billing credits, you can't legally claim that you're using clean energy, because the right to say that has been sold by the developer. These subscriptions cannot, you're not citing these projects, and therefore they can't be used as part of a resiliency hub if that was a direction that the municipality wanted to take it. And there's also no access to the new federal incentives that are available for municipalities. You don't get any extra money because of the federal funding that's now available. That's all just going to the developers. And most of the equity that comes out of these solar subscription projects are leaving the state to these out-of-state developers, rather than staying local and being funneled back into the local economy. Next slide, please. Another reason you'd be interested in owning one of these projects is because it allows the municipality to site the project themselves. I mentioned this in the last slide, but when the municipality is able to site it themselves, they can be really strategic about it, whether it's on a landfill or on their roof. It can build a significant amount of resilience and keep the equity in the community. Additionally, solar moratoriums are popping up all over Maine to prevent these large-scale subscription projects. And there's a whole event that we're doing next week, or talk next week, where we'll dive further into this issue. Next slide, please. So if you want to develop your own solar project or DER, these are a few of the next steps that you can take for pre-development. So you're going to want to gather at least 1 year's worth of the municipality's electricity bills. This way you can see how much electricity you're using, so that you can begin to get an idea of what size project you're looking to do. And the size will also depend on the municipality's goals. If they're just looking to offset a certain percentage or all of it. You'll also want to evaluate the various municipally owned land and roof space that's available. See what areas that you can actually develop solar, and what are areas where the community would want to see that solar. Some place like a landfill is probably a lot better than a lot that the municipality owns that's completely wooded and would require tree clearing. You'll also want to take a look at your local ordinances to see if they support the project development. You'll also want to go on pre-development site walks with contractors and begin to create a rough financial projection. What I put together today was using figures that are kind of on par with what the market supports right now, but it's called the solar coaster for a reason. It is changing constantly, so you're going to want to continue to get updated quotes from contractors. After the community is on board, you're going to want to write and administer an RFP, a request for proposal, and evaluate the bids and select a contractor after getting those proposals back. After that, you'll want to bond the project at the annual town meeting if you end up getting a bid that's suitable for the project and for the town. Next slide, please. So that's all I have on that today, but I wanted to let you all know about future events. We have a follow-up to this, Building Stronger Communities, Municipal Solar Site Planning and Ordinance Development, and we're having that on May 3rd. And the Zoom link is in the is on the screen, but will also be sent out via email. A Climate to Thrive is also hosting a statewide interconnection conference on June 22nd, and we're doing that at the Hutchison Center in Belfast. A lot of these distributed energy resource projects like solar and batteries, they're having some challenges interconnecting with the grid, and they're not necessarily because they would damage the grid in any way, but there's a lot of gatekeeping happening right now at the utility level. And so at this conference, we're going to be looking at policies that other states have implemented that support the implementation and interconnection of these distributed energy resources like solar. And then I also wanted to ping the Maine Municipal Association Innovation and Technology Conference that's happening on June 23rd, so the next day, at the University of Maine in Orono. Next slide, please. So I'm happy to open it up now and answer any questions that the group may have, kind of allow for discussion.
Beth, can you clarify what you mean by a community resilience hub?
Mm-hmm. So this would be an area where the community could come during a blackout event or a power outage event that lasts longer than a few hours. And so it's an area where people could come to maybe recharge their phones, or it could serve as a warming center for people that have lost heat. They become increasingly critical as power outages become more prolonged. In Texas, for example, in 2021, 800 people died when there was a 5-day blackout after a winter storm. And had there been a place for these people to go, a resiliency hub, a warming center, a lot of people died because of a lack of access to heat. So strategically placing these hubs across municipalities or local areas can really help resilience during these events. They can also help avoid these events. This is really getting into the weeds, but when paired with battery and a smart demand flexible technology, sometimes grid operators will shut down sections of the grid because of a mismatch of supply and demand that can really damage the system. But if there are strategic resilience hubs placed around the system that respond to grid signals, they can either start supplying energy or start reducing the energy use to non-critical services at any given point based on grid signals to avoid those types of grid operator led blackout events. So something different than a tree falling down. Is that helpful?
Yes.
Well, and you can also, oh, sorry, I was just going to chime in. You can also strategically plan a resilience hub. So it's more than a warming center and a place to charge phones. It can also power critical services. So it could power the police department or the fire department or a pharmacy, for example, where you need to keep medicines cool, or a grocery store. So you can plan them very strategically to keep more services available.
Thank you, Johannah.
Sounds like it's heavily battery dependent.
Yes, but it can also integrate solar. So depending on what you plan for, the level of blackout that you plan for, that'll really determine the size of the battery. And the battery, when paired with solar, can act as an islanding inverter. And so you can still generate solar power that feeds into the battery that then feeds into the hub instead of exporting it to the grid. So that can potentially reduce the necessary size of the battery. But yes, it would be battery dependent.
Yes, thank you so much.
Hillary, you want to go ahead?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, that was really interesting and informative. I understand that this is all about generating power for use by the municipality, right? And that year one savings for MDI, that $67,000 was a savings for the cost that the municipality would have paid, right?
Yeah.
For their other historic power source. So what does that 10% adder about domestic content mean? Does that have anything to do with residential use or no?
So that's looking at where the material is coming from, where that was produced. And so that's trying to help support USA produced solar panels and using US steel for the racking. So
Beth, I think I heard you mention that the net metering laws are set to expire at some point.
So they don't have a set date where they're expiring, but net energy billing was put in place as kind of a Kickstarter for solar in Maine. And so the legislator is looking at what net energy billing phase 2 will be, and nobody has an answer for what that is or when it will be implemented. But I can confidently say that solar incentives will probably never be as good as they are right now. And the window in which to capitalize on the program currently in Maine is shrinking. So I would, from my guess, as a guess, I would say probably within the next 2 to 3 years, we'll be seeing a shift. But projects that get their net energy billing agreement in place before that shift happens are going to be grandfathered into the program that exists right now. And so they'll keep the benefits from developing these projects all the way through the net energy billing agreement, which is typically 20 years.
Yes, just purely economically speaking, this is an absolutely incredible time, particularly for municipal solar because of the Inflation Reduction Act, the rapidly increasing electrical rates here in Maine, regardless of whether you're in CMP territory or Versant territory, and the fact that net energy billing is still in place. It is a phenomenal time for municipalities. And so even if a municipality doesn't have an emissions reduction goal, this is something that just makes economic sense right now.
Like I said, I was at the PUC earlier this week, and I know for a fact in early July we're going to be looking at even higher electricity rates from both CMP and Versant.
And do you see net billing just being shut off or sort of tinkered with? And it seems like California has been modifying their net billing laws to increasingly require batteries, things like that.
Yeah, I don't think the program's going to go away completely at all. Maine has a lot of incentives to want to keep diversifying our energy resources and our energy portfolio. And so I think that we're still going to push to get solar onto the grid. I don't know what that phase 2 is going to look like, but I do believe that the incentives will still be strong and still be here.
Tanya.
Just a quick plug. There's other money out there to help towns get there. For instance, there's community action grants available if your town's enrolled in the Community Resilience Partnership to do that planning work, so that can be covered and you can get a contractor in and work through those initial bits of it. And there's other support out there too for towns, so they don't have to completely do it by themselves.
That's a really important point. And actually here on MDI, the town of Mount Desert currently has a community action grant exactly for that pre-development work, which they're contracted with Beth through a Climate to Thrive to do. So that initial assessment of potential sites, economic modeling, working all the way up and really doing it in a community driven way. So the community is involved and educated and brought up to speed throughout, and working up to the request for proposals and selecting a contractor. So yeah, it's something you can do with those grants. It's a great way to do it.
I feel like I'm hogging the bandwidth here, so if someone else wants to talk, I should back off. Would anyone else like to ask a question? I seem to have a lot.
I think you have a go ahead, Doug.
Okay. We have issues both with the town and with some of our home visits of this sort of chicken or egg sizing of solar arrays. You know, the people's homes and the town both are getting ready, or we're trying to push them into increasing their electricity demands by quite a lot, you know, through EV charging and heat pumps and those sorts of things. So just collecting their annual electric bills underestimates the size of the grid that should be. But if they overbuild it, the power just goes back to Versant, is my understanding. Do you have any hints on addressing that kind of problem?
That's a great question, Doug, and it's something that I think was mentioned yesterday at the distributed grid planning conference, distribution grid planning workshop from the PUC. I don't have an answer for that right now. I know that roughly each heat pump that you should add, for every heat pump that you're planning to add, you should add roughly 2 kilowatts to the system. And then it really depends on the electric vehicle. So you can talk to your solar contractor about what you kind of project that fleet will look like and how many like charging ports that you're going to want. Because again, it will be dependent on the size of the battery, the size of how many cars, all of that. And so you're going to want to kind of get that specific information and talk to the contractors because they'll have pretty detailed information about that increasing electricity pull.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, I think it's just a great thing to talk to contractors about. You do want to try to think as comprehensively and as far into the future as possible. And you're absolutely right, Doug, that for pretty much anybody, unless they're already have a charger, have transitioned fully to heat pumps, hopefully their electrical demand is going to be increasing as compared to their current bills and current usage. So talking with the contractor, planning for that is really important. Yeah. And there's great incentives for heat pumps and chargers and things like that right now as well. So jump on those too at the moment.
That's our stock and trade in what we do over here, is those kind of incentives. And this may be off topic. You tell me if it is. I've been toying with the idea of sort of mini ownership model community solar projects in town that would, say, be on a church roof. A lot of churches are, especially these little sort of summer chapels that we seem to have here, struggle with their bills. And if they could earn some money by leasing roof space for a small array that might cover 3 or 4 homes, it seems like it would be good for them, good advertising for community solar, and would save a few homeowners some money. Is this an appropriate time to talk about that?
We really like the way you're thinking. I'm just going to say that, and I'll turn it over to Beth. It's a great thing to talk about.
You kind of just summarized what we're looking at for co-op solar, which isn't necessarily a municipal conversation, but I'm happy to expand on that a little bit, where we're looking at financing these arrays and putting them on large roofs across the island. But financing them in a way that would allow low and moderate income community members to also have access to ownership. And so we're really excited about that. We have our steering committee together, and we're looking at kind of launching that first co-op solar project in Maine and kind of modeling it so other communities can do it themselves. Yeah.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. So I hope I'll be in the loop on that. It seems like establishing a legal and accounting system for these little things is a stumbling block. That in my mind anyway.
There are people that can help you with that. So we've been working with a couple of different entities out of Massachusetts. There's folks that can help with the financial modeling, with the different types of agreements that you need and the legalities. Yep.
Great. I'm hoping to establish one right here on one of my shop roofs soon. So I'm really interested in being sort of a demonstration project for this. Thank you so much.
Is it possible we're to a place 15 minutes early where everyone's questions are answered?
Hard to believe.
That was extremely thorough. Thank you, Beth. That was lovely. I'm hoping there are other thoughts, questions.
Yes, I do have one other thought, extending on this idea of co-op solar. Have you seen it done on a larger scale, where rather than a roof and having 4 or 5, but taking something like a landfill and having a cooperative model for owners, particularly here, a lot of people maybe can afford it, but they have too much tree cover. They just don't have the appropriate roof or land that has enough exposure.
Yeah, and those arrays even exist right now, and we are looking at it for a co-op model as well. But we have an array on a landfill, just as you said, here on Mount Desert Island in Southwest Harbor, where it's an ownership structure, but there's not that upfront financing to delay that. Or to avoid those upfront costs for low and moderate income community members. And so we're still looking at a pathway for our co-op solar, but there are solar projects that do exist right now that can be owned by community members. And I believe Versant is the only company that has developed those arrays.
You mean Revision, not Versant.
Sorry, thank you. Revision.
Yes.
Wrong.
I'm gonna say, whoa.
Too many V's and R's. No, Revision is the one developing that, certainly not Versant. And so if you were interested in pursuing that, you can contact me, and I can put you in touch with somebody from Revision that might be able to help construct one of those arrays. Though I would encourage you to look at a financing model that allows access for low and moderate community members, like the co-op solar model that we're developing.
And how would we find that? Because we'd love to go to the select board with something like that.
Yeah. Well, first, for the municipality, I would encourage, if you do have a landfill, to prioritize that space to power your buildings, because that's an immediate return on investment, and is really great. But if there's additional space, like at the Tremont landfill, we're looking at putting potentially expanding that array and adding on space for the co-op solar project. So it will need to be 2 separately metered projects, and so that's an additional challenge. But I would prioritize that landfill space first for the municipal use, and then have that additional space for co-op solar.
We've been working to try to get an array on the local school, which has a large roof, and early projections seem to indicate that we might be able to cover all municipal use by that array on the school. And I think it's great PR to have it on the school. But we also have a dump. We're so lucky.
Well, great. Are you in CMP or Versant territory?
Versant, yeah.
Versant. Okay, so then, yeah. So I know that CB, who is in CMP territory, is also working on kind of the same financial structure project. And so we're going to have separate co-op projects, just because we're in separate grid territories. But if A Climate to Thrive is able to launch launch our co-op solar project, what we would hopefully have is a structure in place to allow others to kind of build off of what we've, the financial model that we've created, and bring that forward to the municipality, and just kind of expand that array using the legal structure and accounting, administrative software that we would be using for our projects.
And I think just to give a rough timeline, I would hope that we'd have some sort of toolkit around that next year at some point to share with folks early on next year. I also wanted to just mention that I dropped in the link for the interconnection conference and Beth's email address. And if anybody is bringing a project to their municipality or any project like that and is bumping up against interconnection issues, feel free to shoot us a quick email if you have questions about it, if something doesn't seem quite right, or you're just wondering how to move forward. Happy to have a quick conversation about that. Yeah, Tanya, I want to turn it back over to you.
I was just curious. I've been hearing that sometimes there's too much distributed power being produced and the grid isn't appropriately set up to manage that. Just wonder if you could speak to that, because it's something I know nothing about and I'd like to.
Yeah, that we're actually going to have an entire conference about that very subject. That's why we're doing the statewide interconnection conference. So right now, it's a particular issue in Versant Power territory. CMP so far has been much better about this, but there are some grid upgrades that need to occur for some projects. These are usually the larger scale projects, like the 500 kilowatt, the 1 megawatt, the 2 megawatt subscription level arrays. For smaller projects that are built on rooftops, the utility at this point is doing quite a bit of gatekeeping in terms of allowing projects online. And so it's not necessarily that the grid cannot support these behind the meter projects. It's that they're highlighting existing issues with the grid, and are being currently burdened with the cost to upgrade large sections of the grid, not just the area that the project would be tied to. So yes, the grid needs work, and yes, it is a challenge, but more than is necessary happens to be because of the utilities process around it, not necessarily the actual infrastructure itself. These projects, in fact, can reduce the need for additional infrastructure investments because of local generation, which reduces the need for large transmission lines, which cost a substantial amount of money. I mentioned earlier that case study, which reduced infrastructure investments, necessary infrastructure investments by 4/5. So it went from $1.2 billion to whatever a fifth of that is. So substantial difference in necessary investment comes from these projects. And so it's about strategically investing in and supporting these projects getting online.
So
yeah, and I think that sorry, go ahead, Tanya.
So if I'm to understand, then I think what you're saying is that it really doesn't pay Versant to receive this electricity, and so there's a little bit of whining going on.
So yeah, and I gave a talk about that actually last month. The issue is the way our rate structure is set up. The utilities are incentivized to build as much of the wires solutions as possible, like transmission and distribution lines, where distributed energy resources, like I said, significantly reduce the need for those types of investments. But again, the utility is incentivized to build as much as they can versus investing in these other types of resources that make the grid more resilient, lower power outages, and reduce customers' bills.
So we've been incentivized to do this, but they haven't yet been, which is a problem, because we all want to be on the same page.
That's exactly right, Tanya. And that's exactly what we'll be talking about at the interconnection conference.
And we want our utilities proactively moving us towards the grid of the future, because it is a grid and a way of functioning that is actually beneficial for all ratepayers, whether they own generation or not, but only if our utilities take us there proactively, as opposed to have to be dragged there. And then all of a sudden there's massive burden on the ratepayers because they didn't, get their act together and move us where we need to go.
How can you put that word out, Johannah? I mean, because there's a lot of news about that and a lot of misinformation about that.
We're working on it.
I'm sure.
The conference is the first step. And I don't know if you saw our recent newsletter, but the intro letter to that was also a step, our recent educational events in March. But yeah, we're working on trying to spread the word statewide, because what you're saying, Doug, is really the heart of the matter, which is that all Maine ratepayers, anybody involved in using electricity in the state of Maine, should have access to this information and to, the transparent, accessible information, so that they're empowered to be part of this transition that has to happen and that is going to happen. And if it happens in a certain way, then they will benefit as Maine ratepayers. And so it's really, it becomes a justice issue, access to that information, and that transparent, clear information, as opposed to, there's going to be a lot of campaigns, like we're seeing a campaign in the Bangor Daily News right now that is misleading and inaccurate. And yeah, we're trying to figure out how to get information out there as clearly and as loudly as something like that.
I'll also be giving a climate chat next month. I'm sorry I didn't put that in as part of upcoming events, but let me just grab that.
I can do that, Beth, while you keep talking.
Oh, yes. So we'll be looking at the way our bills are structured right now, the actual impact that solar at large, whether you own, subscribe, or have nothing to do with a project, how that impacts the bill, and look at other ways that the bill the rates are rising and in what categories, because it's really important that people understand that the rising rates that we are seeing have barely anything to do with the net energy billing program in Maine right now, and have everything to do with the price of fossil fuels and continuing to invest in large scale transmission lines.
This is a huge roadblock to our program here in Brooklyn. The rumor mill cranks on with all kinds of stuff. And it's very hard for us to urge any of our home inspection customers to consider solar, because there are substantial costs associated with being turned down by Versant. Brooklyn, go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So there shouldn't be costs associated by for at least like rooftop arrays, for household level arrays. I think it costs something like $100 to apply to see if your project would be eligible for interconnection. And without that interconnection agreement, I would recommend that people do not put any money down until you have that in your hand. And so if a contractor is asking for money down prior to having that interconnection agreement in place, maybe ask a few more questions.
Well, I'm trying to get information out of Sundog. They quoted me for a rooftop array, and they wanted a 30% down payment before they started engineering. And I said, well, what if I don't get permission to hook up? And they said, well, we'll refund your money except for $1,000.
I was told again by Sundog that rooftop solar for homes, at least, was not an issue as far as getting that completed.
And for the majority of households, that is correct. And so there's a lot of news out there making it seem like people cannot construct solar on their roof at this moment because the grid is full, and that's not true. So the vast majority of projects will be able to be passed with no problem through the interconnection process. It again, it depends on the utility territory that you're in. In CMP, you usually get that turnaround in a week. In Versant territory, they should be in less than 10 business days, but it's been variable.
That's good news. The school project, Revision has asked the town to pay $300 for a Versant, what they call
Pre-application.
Yes, pre-application fee, which seems reasonable, but and that's a big array, or much bigger than my rooftop thing. But $1,000, putting that on the table for a risky thing sounds risky to me. for something I had asked Sundog if I could just pay for a pre-application permit, and they didn't get back, so I don't know what their policy.
So the pre-application is good for like level 2 size projects. So those are anything over 25 kilowatts. And that's because a level 2 application is about $2,500. And so that'll create a much more in-depth screening process and information from the utility, so that pre-application just fills developers in with a lot of information about that grid area before they put the money into developing it. So they're able to submit a pre-application just saying what the size of their array would be or project would be, the type of generator. A lot of like just bullet points that don't necessarily need to come with an electrician stamped certified plans. And that's what level 2 projects need. And a level 1 application, I don't believe it comes with a high burden of on the contractor side to submit that. I don't think it comes with a lot of electrical designs and stuff. It's filling out a sheet. So I might recommend speaking to other contractors about potentially building your array, just to see what they say.
Revision said it was too small, and Solar Logic said, don't bother because you won't get hooked up. They said that to me on the phone. I couldn't believe it. So
I do know that there is a line in Brooklyn that needs upgrades that Versant will simply not connect to at this time. And so there are 2 areas of the Versant grid that I know where that's the case, and one of them, unfortunately, is Brooklyn. And so I think Solar Logic's at that point is trying to give you the best advice possible, which I think for that line is probably the case unless you decided to go off grid. Anyway, we're getting to the end of the time, so I want to pass it back to Tanya. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you both so much. This has been extremely enlightening and really clarifying for me, and I hope for everyone else. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you all who came and asked good questions and thought a lot. I hope that we'll be able to help you move forward with projects, and know that we're all here to be resources for you, and we're here to be resources for each other.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you, everyone.
I will put the recording of this up, and I'll send you links, Johannah and Beth, to share with everyone else, and we'll get that out there. Thank you again very much. Wonderful program.
Thank you.